I'm a senior consultant on the IT solution team at Sikich. I've been working with Microsoft Cloud Services, primarily with Microsoft 365 and Azure for the past few years, really with a focus on helping clients drive towards full cloud enablement. Today, I'll be talking about Microsoft Endpoint Manager and how the services it offers can help you accomplish a modern PC management solution. While the solution I'll be highlighting supports a fully remote workforce, it can also be used to streamline PC deployments for both hybrid and on-site workers. Many organizations' IT environments today are mixed and use cloud-attached approach, meaning they use a combination of both cloud and on-premise technologies. As organizations move towards full cloud enablement, it's common for their environments to transition from on-premise only to cloud attached, and finally to their end goal of being fully cloud-based. The PC management solution we will showcase today supports both hybrid or cloud attached environments as well as cloud only. Before we get into talking about the technology behind the solution, I'd like to first take a moment to touch on today's post-pandemic workforce. According to research done by Spiceworks, Ziff Davis, a leading provider in technology marketing data, 25% of the workforce will be remote in a post-pandemic world. A study they did at the height of the recent public health crisis showed that 61% of the overall workforce went remote at that time. The breakdown of the research shows that while 74% will remain fully in the office, 6% will go fully remote, and 19% will be hybrid, spending some of their time in the office and the rest remote. It's clear the nature of work is changing, and as technology continues to drive innovation, employees are looking for employers who will provide a modern workplace. One challenge many companies face is how they can manage remote computers and users. They need to be able to implement security policies, deploy applications, and manage company data. This is where Microsoft Endpoint Manager comes in to provide a solution to this challenge. In 2019, Microsoft rebranded two existing products, Intune and Configuration Manager, to the Endpoint Manager suite of products, which now encompasses their their device management products. So Intune is their cloud-based device manager. Configuration Manager is an on-premise management tool that can be co-managed with the cloud via Intune. Desktop Analytics, which can give you insight into the state of your devices and applications. Autopilot, which helps pre-configure devices. And lastly, Azure AD is an identity provider for devices. And this is really how users will authenticate to their devices. Endpoint Manager includes products that are key to managing remote PCs. At the end of this presentation, I'll demo the Endpoint Manager Admin Center and how, when properly combined, these products create a modern PC management solution that's powered by the Microsoft Cloud. I'd like to start with discussing Azure AD and Intune. So Azure AD, or Azure Active Directory, or sometimes just called AAD, is a cloud-based identity and access management service. So this service helps your employees access external resources, such as Microsoft 365, the Azure portal, and thousands of other applications. Azure AD is what allows us to enforce multi-factor authentication via conditional access policy. This protects user accounts with MFA, but also allows bypass of MFA for safe locations. Linking PCs to Azure AD is what provides company management of the computers. Depending on your Azure AD join type, this can allow users to sign into their PCs with their M365 credentials, providing identity management. This is one of the biggest benefits for companies that are potentially using workgroup PCs for remote computers, or computers that rarely have contact with their on-premise domain controller. Azure Active Directory PCs can provide a way to enforce secure sign-in methods like a standard password or Windows Hello for Business, which supports biometrics, such as fingerprint scanning or Face ID. So I'd like to talk about the three different join types for Azure Active Directory. So Azure AD joined is for corporate-owned and managed devices. So if it's Azure AD joined, users will authenticate using a corporate ID that exists in Azure Active Directory, which is typically just their M365 email and password. Authentication is only through Azure Active Directory or their M365 credentials. Next, we have hybrid Azure AD joined devices. These are for corporate owned and managed devices, and they authenticate using a corporate ID that exists at a local Active Directory level or on your domain controller. And ideally, you'd be syncing your user objects to Azure AD or M365 using AD Connect. And authentication can be done going through that domain controller or also through Azure AD. And then lastly, we have Azure AD registered devices. So these are personally owned computers or devices, but corporate enabled. So the users will authenticate to the device using their own local account, possibly like their own personal Microsoft account. But authentication to corporate resources, such as applications, is done using their user ID in Azure Active Directory or Microsoft 365. Next is Intune. So Intune is the device management solution in Endpoint Manager. One of its primary features are device configurations. These are much like a modern version of group policy, allowing you to push out new applications and Windows settings to new and existing computers. It also includes the ability to manage Windows updates on enrolled PCs, letting you determine the update schedule, the action Windows takes when the updates are released, either installing or delaying them for a specified amount of time. You can also set what actions are taken when a PC is falling behind on release updates, which could be to ultimately force the update to install the next time the PC reboots, or take a less intrusive route and automatically notify your IT staff so that they can follow up. Additionally, Intune can give you the ability to remotely wipe a PC. This can be useful not just for situations where a PC is reported lost or stolen, but also for troubleshooting. Intune is the service that is going to complete the configuration in Windows. At its core, it's a device management solution, but it can be used to automate the deployment of applications and apply device configurations. Examples of this are things like enforcing encryption via BitLocker, configuring the Windows firewall, enforcing power settings. It is easiest to think of Intune device configurations exactly like group policy, what is traditionally the on-premise Active Directory environment. Many of the configurations that you can do from a on-premise group policy, you can replicate via Intune. Besides being used for the initial configuration of devices, Intune gives you the bonus of being able to deploy future applications and configurations. If you remove apps or policies from devices that are already being rolled out and actively used. You can completely manage remote PCs with Azure AD and Intune. A lot of our clients utilize these two features of Endpoint Manager the most, and this is where we'll spend a lot of time during the demo. What is Autopilot? I could do an entire presentation on Autopilot alone, but in this presentation, I'm only going to briefly touch base on it. So Autopilot is used to streamline the Windows out-of-box experience. This is when you complete the initial prompts you were walked through when you first boot up a new out-of-box PC or a freshly wiped computer. Doing things like accepting the terms of service, setting up a username and password, joining to networks. Configuring Autopilot profiles allows you to predetermine all of these choices and settings on behalf of the user. For a PC that's registered in Autopilot, none of those options are ever seen by the end user. The first prompt they reach is to connect to the internet. After that, they're presented with the company name and a prompt to enter their credentials. This makes the process a lot less intimidating if a user is walking through this themselves due to being remote. Additionally, if your IT staff is deploying many PCs at once, this can be a big time saver. Once credentials are entered, the PC is going to automatically join to the domain or join to Azure AD, depending on your environment, and it'll automatically be enrolled in Intune. It'll then start kicking off configuring the computer for you. So whatever policies and applications you have configured in Intune, after signing in with Autopilot, it will automatically configure those features. So Autopilot is fantastic when deployed properly, but it is a little more complex to deploy and manage. So we'll briefly touch base on it during this demo. If you are interested in Autopilot specifically, our contact information will be presented at the end of this presentation, and we can talk about it with you in greater detail. So next, I want to talk about some use cases for Endpoint Manager. So what are some scenarios where Endpoint Manager has been used? So here are a few examples of where we've used a mix of these features to provide a solution. So client A was an Azure AD and Intune solution. So I recently helped a client that had servers that were hosted in the cloud. They were using a domain controller for authentication, an RDS server, which was mainly being used just for QuickBooks. They had a main office along with dozens of remote users all over the country. The remote users had no connection to the main office or the domain controller, so they were just workgroup PCs. They were paying to support a complex environment that no longer suited their needs. So the first thing we did was migrate them to QuickBooks Online, which removes the need for the remote desktop server. Then we configured Intune policies that mimic their existing environment. Then we migrated all of their users and all of the computers to be Azure AD PCs. And then finally, we were able to decommission their cloud hosted servers. Now remote PCs, which were originally workgroup PCs, are managed through Azure AD, which provides better security and identity management. Along with this, the project resulted in thousands of dollars worth of savings as we were able to decommission those cloud servers. And they're no longer paying to support that environment. So client B, an Autopilot, Azure AD, and Intune solution. So client B is a situation where we used Autopilot as a solution. We took on a new client that did not have any existing server infrastructure. All of their applications were already web or cloud-based. They had no sort of PC management. So what we did was we set them up with standard Intune policies to enforce security standards and identity protection. We configured all of their apps that they were using to be deployed via Intune and Autopilot. So now anytime that they hire a new user, we register the device in Autopilot. We can ship it directly to the user. They sign in, and within a few hours, they have all of the applications that they need, and they're able to start working. We've also used Microsoft Endpoint Manager in situations where clients have an existing server infrastructure that needs to remain intact for whatever reason. We've deployed hybrid autopilot where PCs remain domain joined, but still receive policies from Azure AD to automatically push those applications and policies. The main goal here is to prepare them for the future when they are ready to move to the cloud. Favorite topic, licensing requirements. Licensing needs are going to vary from company to company depending on multiple factors. Below are just three of the most common licenses that we use when deploying Endpoint Manager solution. The most important factor here is that each of these licenses include a Intune license, which is needed for Endpoint Manager to work. So M365 Business Premium license is $22 per user per month, does require an annual commitment. E3 license is $36, E5 is $57. Really the differences between the Business Premium, the E3 and the E5 is going to come down to what features they provide. The more expensive licenses are going to give you things like M365 Defender or a Teams voice license and much more other features. If you plan to deploy Endpoint Manager across your organization, I advise that you consult with a reseller to ensure that you're making the best financial choice for licensing. We'll get into a demo where I'll go over the Endpoint Manager Admin Center, but I want to just touch base on joining a computer to Azure AD first. Joining a computer to Azure AD is pretty simple. There are some other factors that come into play. If you're already in like a on-premise domain joined environment, these steps may be different. But for a new computer, if you go through the out-of-box experience, you can simply go to the settings screen, go to Access Work and School. You'll click Connect. And then here in the highlighted red box, there's your option to join to Azure Active Directory. Once you click that, you'll be prompted to sign in with the user's M365 credentials and go through MFA. Setting up a new computer at the out-of-box screen, you can join to Azure Active Directory directly from there, but it does depend on some of your enrollment policies and things like that. But simply put, when you power on the computer, if you just sign in with your M365 credentials, typically it'll join it to Azure AD. If you're looking to join computers to Azure Active Directory that already have an existing profile on them, there is a third-party tool that will help you migrate the profile and data for you. So ProfileWiz or ProfWiz by Forensic does an awesome job of migrating the profile. And the best part is it's in the future, it may do a full demo on migrating workstations to Azure AD using that tool, but we've used it a lot in the past. And like I said, if you already have computers that users have data on it, all their applications, and you want to put them to Azure, Profile Wiz by Forensic is definitely the way to go. And now we'll get into an overview of the Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to do is you'll go to portal.office.com and you'll sign in. And here on the left side, as long as you're a global admin or have the proper permissions, you'll have an admin button, which will then take you to the admin center. We're going to do show all, and down here at the bottom, we have our different admin centers that we can launch. As we can see here, Endpoint Manager is an option, and we also have Azure Active Directory. One thing to note is that if you come in here and you don't see Endpoint Manager underneath your admin centers, it's because you do not have an Intune license in your tenant. So you need to either go sign up for a trial or add any license that includes Intune, refresh your screen, and then Endpoint Manager will show here underneath your admin center. Oh, I see someone saying they're still not seeing the demo. Let's see. Mike, are you able to see the screen? Try to share and start sharing again.
Yes, I see the demo.
Okay, sorry, going back to it. Thank you. So the first thing that I want to talk about in Endpoint Manager is groups and how we manage the users and computers. So in Endpoint Manager, if we just go to groups on the left side, there are two main groups that we're going to look at. You can name them whatever you want, but typically in our standard deployment, we have Intune Manage Users and Intune Manage Windows 10. So we'll start with the users group. And this is a dynamic group that we set up. And the reason it's dynamic is we have these dynamic membership rules that we apply to the group. And really what that's looking for is, for this users group, it's looking for any user that's assigned an Intune license and is active in the tenant. Any user that has an Intune license will automatically be added to this group. And this is useful because when we go to deploy applications and policies, we have to tell Endpoint Manager who and where we want those policies and applications to apply to. So having a dynamic membership set up that will automatically add your Intune licensed users to here so that they're already receiving those policies. So that way, the opposite of that would be if we just had a standard assigned group where we'd have to come in and manually add users every single time that we hire someone, or if users leave the company, we'd have to come in here and remove them. Making a dynamic membership just takes away from that overhead. And then we do the same thing with our Intune Manage Windows 10. It's also a dynamic membership group. And underneath our dynamic membership rules, we're really looking at, is the device being managed by Intune? Is it a Windows device? Is it at least Windows 10? And is it owned by the company? The next tab that I want to talk about is just the users tab. This is where you can manage all your users within the organization. One thing I did want to highlight is that Endpoint Manager does support self-service password reset. You can lock it down to a security group. So I just created an SSPR security group, and you add in the users that you to be enabled for self-service password reset. You can also change the authentication methods that they have to go through for resetting their passwords. You can enable notifications for when passwords get reset. This is useful for remote users. So that way, if they get locked out of their PC, they can reset the passwords themselves. Next, we're going to go to our devices tab. When we first click in here, we get a nice overview of all the devices. So it's split up by platform. We can see enrollment alerts, compliance status. We can quickly switch between all of these. We do have a monitor tab, and this is where we can get our desktop analytics. And we have a ton of different reports that we can look at for IT admins. So our encryption report is a key one. So what computers are being encrypted with BitLocker? Is there any failures? Do we have any non-compliant devices? Are there any policies that are having issues applying to computers for whatever reason? We can look at software updates and see what computers are up to date with our update policies. The next thing I want to get into is configuration profiles. So underneath our devices tab, down below here underneath policy, we have configuration profiles. And like I said, this is just like group policy is like on an on-premise Active Directory domain controller. I just created a couple standard policies that we implement to a lot of our different clients. Really the main one here being a BitLocker, for example. So if we look at BitLocker, we scroll down, take a moment to load. So we can see we've got basics. We can give it a name and a description, who we're assigning it to. So this comes back to our group. We have Intune Manage Windows 10, that dynamic group that will contain all of our Intune managed devices. We can exclude groups or create an excluded group if there are maybe a computer here that doesn't have a compatible TPM chip, or maybe doesn't need encrypted for BitLocker for whatever reason. We can create an exclusion group. But then here we have our configuration settings. Once again, this one is just BitLocker, encrypting the device. Does it have a compatible TPM chip? Do we need to require additional authentication at startup? Which drives are we enabling, the OS drive and fixed data drive? Do we want users to see the recovery options when BitLocker turns on? Probably not. This is set up to where it's just going to silently. Another one that we like as a standard is configuring OneDrive settings. So if these PCs are being remote, they don't have access to map drives or anything like that, and you want to protect company data. So once again, this here, we're using our Intune Managed Users group for all of our Intune Managed users. And underneath our configuration settings, it's going to silently sign users into OneDrive using their Windows credentials. So since they're Azure AD joined, they're already signed in with their M365 credentials. So it'll automatically sign them into OneDrive. Require users to confirm large delete operations. So if they accidentally Control A and click delete, it's going to give them a warning saying, hey, you're deleting 1,000 files. Are you sure you want to proceed? Silently move Windows known folders to OneDrive. So desktop, documents, pictures, automatically move those to OneDrive. So that way if the computer is lost or stolen or corrupted, we set them up with a new computer, sign them in, and all of their data comes right back. We disable the tutorial, so that way, once again, it just silently signs in, sets everything up, and we enable OneDrive files on demand. Another simple one is just power settings. So we can control when the computer goes to sleep, whether it's plugged in, not plugged in, on battery, when the display gets turned off, force that it requires a password when the computer wakes up, just basic power settings we can control from Endpoint Manager. This is just like a security feature, PowerShell script block logging, something that a lot of people will set up on their on-premise domain controller with group policy, and one that we can replicate here in Endpoint Manager. And this one's pretty simple. It's just the configuration setting that we go to in Endpoint Manager, and it's just an enable disable feature. So turn on PowerShell script block logging enabled. Once again, applying this to our Intune Manage Windows 10 group. And then lastly, sign-in screen, self-service password reset. So this configuration profile, it's custom OMA URI string. Sometimes if you have specific features that may not be supported within Endpoint Manager, you can use custom OMA URI settings. And what this does is it just puts a reset password link at the lock screen. So where you would sign into a computer, there's a reset password link. When they press that, it opens up a secure browser right at that lock screen, and it just takes them directly to the M365 password reset website and allows them to go through self-service password reset. So that way they have a web browser on the computer, at least at the lock screen, to go through those settings if they had locked themselves out. And then I wanted to briefly just touch base. So if we do go to create a new configuration profile, we do have a lot of different options. And Endpoint Manager, as you've probably seen, supports other platforms. The purpose of this presentation is to focus really on Windows 10 and later devices, but there is capability to support other platforms such as Android, iOS, and Mac. But here underneath profile types, this is where we configure our configuration profiles. And there's a settings catalog and templates. So we go to our settings catalog, we just say test, and we go to add a setting. Microsoft's already built in all of these categories here that you can just create your policies using this settings catalog. So BitLocker, for example, if we click that, it'll take a moment to load, but we'll get all of our different options for BitLocker. Same thing really with all of these different options. So here's BitLocker, and here's where we can check the box to require drive encryption or configure recovery password rotation. Same thing with Bluetooth or camera settings or connectivity. There's a ton of different options here for really anything that you're looking for to control on end user's PC. There's also a search bar up at the top if there's anything specific that you're looking for. You can see our OneDrive settings are there, power settings, all sorts of different options are available. Another one that's really useful are pre-configuring VPN connections for end users. Same thing with pre-configuring wireless networks. Our other profile type would be templates, which is similar to the settings catalog, but they're all just right here. One thing I will say is this is where we come in for our custom OMA configuration. So you can see here, like some of these profile types, I did end up using administrative templates. Some we did endpoint protection just from our settings catalog, or we did our custom OMI or OMA URI configuration. Just about everything that you could ask for will be between our settings catalog and our templates within the configuration profiles. Next, I want to talk about updates. So here in our devices screen, this is where we can configure all our different update policies. So we have update rings for Windows 10 and later. We can control feature updates specifically, and then also our quality updates for Windows 10 and later. So here's just an example policy, and you can see an overview of the settings. So how long do we defer the feature update? How long do we defer our quality update? So we can take a look a little bit deeper at the properties of this policy. So here we can see, do we want to allow Microsoft product updates? Do we want to allow Windows drivers to be updated? Like I said, we can set our deferral period in days for quality updates and feature updates. Do we want to upgrade Windows 10 devices to Windows 11? What's our servicing channel? Typically general availability, but you may have a use case where you want to change that. What are your active hours? So 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. It's not going to install any updates or take any actions. Only outside of that time will it reboot the computer or auto install any updates. Do we want users to be able to pause updates? Probably not. Do we want them to be able to check updates themselves? I like that feature is enabled. It's useful for troubleshooting, but maybe you don't want users updating their computers. And then we have deadlines. We have deadlines for the feature updates and the quality updates, and we can set grace periods. And if we go within that, we can automatically set it to reboot. And then once again, we're applying that to our dynamic group. Another feature that's on the screen is scripts. So scripts is useful sometimes, maybe between the configuration profiles, you can't do what you want to do, or you have something on premise that needs a PowerShell script or something connecting to an on-premise service that it makes more sense to control with a PowerShell script or deploy. So here you can come in and just manually PowerShell scripts. It's pretty easy. This one is just a VPN that I had laying around that I threw in here, but it's pretty simple. You just add, give it a name of test, and then we just upload our file, configure a couple different options, and then assign it to what devices that script's going to run. Next, we're going to talk about compliance policies. So after we've set up our update rings and our configuration profiles and all our other settings, we want to make sure that the devices are actually receiving these policies. So we have a Windows 10 and 11 compliance policy that we can take a look at. So underneath our properties, we have our name, and then we can configure a variety of different compliance settings. So one that we use pretty frequently is to monitor BitLocker. So we want BitLocker enabled on the computers to protect company data if it's lost or stolen. So we want to make sure that if BitLocker is not enabled on a computer for whatever reason, we're being notified. Other things here are requiring passwords on the computer and when they wake up. Another option would be to enforce the firewall or ensure that the firewall is turned on, or that the computer has a trusted platform module or TPM chip. Or we want to make sure that antivirus is required or enabled and required on the computer. And the cool thing about compliance policies is we have actions for non-compliance, and you can do a couple different things here. So one thing that we like to do is send an email to the user. So you create a message template and they'll receive an email saying that their device has been marked as non-compliant. And then typically what we'll do is we'll set up a distribution list that includes either IT admins or if you have third-party IT. And anytime that the device is non-compliant, it'll email the user along with that distribution list, notifying everyone that it's non-compliant, and then someone can take action to resolve those issues. Here we also have our reports. We can look at the status, device, or our user and device status to check their compliance options as well. Underneath the device tab, we also have conditional access that we can configure. So I'd mentioned that earlier in the presentation. Conditional access you can set up to control when, who, where has access to M365 resources. So one conditional access policy that we use at a lot of different companies is MFA bypass. And what this does is we create a security group and we add in the users that we want. So I create an MFA bypass group. And then we select what cloud apps or actions we want to take. So right now I have it applying to all cloud applications. And then we set our conditions. And for this example, our conditions are that we're including that this policy is going to be applied to any location, except we're excluding any trusted locations. And then lastly, underneath grant, we say grant access to all of these cloud applications. So keep in mind, all locations except safe locations require MFA. And what that does is, like I said, we set up those safe locations using the public IP address of your office or offices. So that way, if users are in those offices and they're using a device that is using that public IP address, they won't be prompted for MFA when they're trying to access M365 resources. This is useful so that way that every single day they go to log into something, they're not being prompted. But it also keeps your account secure, because if someone happens to have their password compromised and someone tries to access their account outside of the office, it will still force MFA. And here at this screen, named locations, this is where we can create our different offices and set our IP ranges. So I just have a main office configured. Lastly, on this screen, I did want to talk about Autopilot. So Autopilot is where you'll go to enroll devices. It's all controlled under device enrollment. And here under our Windows enrollment, this is where we can configure our Windows Autopilot deployment program. This is also where you can control like Windows Hello for Business. If you did want to change or enable whether they can use biometrics or their PIN length or their history, you can see allow biometrics is there. This is where we can configure automatic enrollment, but really our Windows Autopilot deployment program, our deployment profile, this is where we can configure a deployment profile and it bypasses all of the out-of-box experience. And this is where we set those properties. So we come in here and we can tell it whether the device is going to be Azure AD joined, whether it's going to be hybrid Azure AD joined, if they're going to see our terms and conditions, the privacy settings, the account options. We can say whether the user account is going to be an admin or a standard user. And then we can even apply a custom name. So typically we use company initials - serial number. And this is where we configure our Autopilot deployment profiles. And then underneath our devices screen, this is where you would come in to add in your devices. So if you purchase like HP computers from a reseller, they can provide you a B file that you can import here. And it'll automatically import your devices into this Autopilot screen. And you can assign your deployment profile to them. So that way when when the employee opens their computer for the first time and powers it on, it's already they'll connect to the internet, sign in, and it'll receive all of those policies and applications that we've configured in Endpoint Manager. Speaking of, the last thing I wanted to talk about is how to deploy applications in Endpoint Manager. So here underneath our app screen, this is where we'll configure our apps underneath our Windows platform. And right now I just have one application in here as an example, but typically most of our clients are going to have a dozen or so applications that we're deploying, such as like Microsoft 365, Google Chrome, Firefox, all sorts of different applications. So this is just one of our remote agents that we use to monitor computers that we want deployed, so we have remote access to them. So here underneath our property section, we have a name and a description. It tells us our app version. We get our install and uninstall commands, so the MSI command to install and uninstall. We can set requirements for the applications. We want it to at least be on Windows 10 1909 for this app to install. And then you do have to configure detection rules. There's a couple different options that you have for detection rules. You can point it to a different file or a registry key, things like that. And we'll look at this in further detail. You can also set dependencies. So if maybe you're installing like Visual Studio applications that require prerequisites be installed before the main application, you can configure your dependencies here so that Endpoint Manager installs those applications in the correct order. And then of course we set our groups for who these apps are being installed for. So looking at that further, let's just say we want to add one ourselves. So we'll do add up here at the top. And then there are different options to add applications. So if you have a Microsoft Store application you need to add, maybe your company has a published app and you want to make sure it's installed in all computers. We have that option. M365 apps, but typically most of the applications that we deploy end up being Windows app, Win32 apps. So when we click that, Win32 apps require a Intune or a .intune win file format, and that's what this remote agent is using. And there is a process to get that done, and I'm not going to go into detail for how that process works. It's really a program that you download, you run it through PowerShell, you'll point it to your MSI exe files, and then it pretty much packages them all together and then spits out an Intune win file for you to upload here to Endpoint Manager. So if I select a file, just as an example, so Firefox, for example, I already have the Intune win file on my computer. So we add in Firefox and it's automatically going to be able to detect some of these options. So the name, platform, app version. So select OK. It auto fills in some things. Sometimes things are missing. It's not always perfect. Publisher, we would just add in Mozilla manually here. We got our app version, category, things like that. We don't need to add a logo for this example. And then as you can see here, that Intune app for a lot of applications, if it's like an MSI or even an EXE that you're using, a lot of times it's going to automatically generate these install commands. Now, if your application maybe doesn't have this kind of support, or you import your application into Endpoint Manager and you don't automatically get these install and uninstall commands, you might have to do some research. Nowadays, with the popularity of Endpoint Manager, a lot of vendors are supporting Intune, and you'll be able to find an Intune guide from vendors that tell you how to configure the application, and it'll be step-by-step with screenshots. If not, a lot of times their support for those applications, if you reach out to, will be able to provide these commands. Or if you're an IT admin and you're familiar with installing these through group policy, it's very similar to that process. Typically, these return codes, we don't really have to modify too much. And then this is where we set our requirements, 64-bit architecture, 1909 at least, along with our other settings. And then this is what I was talking about with detection rules. Typically, you have to figure out a detection rule. Like I said, if you find a guide, depending on the application, they'll help you through this. If not, it's typically not too bad if you're an IT admin to figure out a manual detection rule. So here are different options. We can have it look for an MSI, we can have it look for a file, or we can have it look for a registry key. So we have a look for a file, we just give it the path, file, and folder. We say, does the folder exist? When was it modified? And this is what will control the reporting back to Endpoint Manager, saying that the app's successfully installed or what's going on. So typically, if you're installing an application using like a file detection rule is perfectly fine, because normally you can just put in the folder path of the program and just look for a specific file that it needs to run. Or registry, of course, is also an option, or really all programs that are installed on a computer are going to have a registry key, so you can just enter that path and tell it, does the key exist, does it not exist, things like that. And then moving on from there, like I said, we have our dependencies, and then we assign it. That's the general demo of Endpoint Manager. You're able to push configuration profiles and apps without using Autopilot. So if you go in here and you add Windows apps to Endpoint Manager and you configure device configuration profiles, you don't need Autopilot. As long as the computers have a join type with Azure, either Azure AD joined or hybrid, and you're managing them with Intune, you can have all of these policies and applications apply to those computers. There are a ton of other features in Endpoint Manager that I didn't hit on, but these are just some of the main ones that we use at most of our clients that help improve their IT infrastructure. And keep in mind, any computers that you're managing with Intune, if you start managing them today, 3 months down the line, if you make changes to these policies or add in new applications, they'll receive those updates. So Endpoint Manager really gives you the ability to monitor all of your devices and provide the solution, whether they're remote or in the office or hybrid. So how can Sikich help you? If you're interested in Endpoint Manager, we can help you deploy all of these policies and applications. We've helped many clients in many different situations, either migrating them from on-prem to cloud only and everything in between. I'd like to thank everyone for their time today and joining me during this presentation. If you have any questions, we'll start going through questions. Ivy had asked earlier in the presentation, is Endpoint Manager the same as Intune. Microsoft had gone through rebranding. So Intune they reference that as really the cloud-based mobile device management aspect of Endpoint Manager. But they are slightly different. It's really Intune is a feature of Endpoint Manager. So Ivy, I see you have 2 questions here. I'm not positive off the top of my head if you can use Windows or if you can use Duo instead of Windows MFA. I know that you can integrate Duo MFA into a lot of different applications, but I don't know if it supports. I don't think you can do Duo MFA for over M365 for like authentication to M365 resources. I could be wrong, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. I can't follow up with you. But does Intune do all that for the Mac suite? Yes. As you saw during the demo, Intune does provide options for managing Mac computers. It looks like Travis has answered that they are using Duo with their M365 suite, so it appears to be possible. Yes, if you're using an E5 license, all of those features will be available to you. Autopilot, Intune, and Azure, and conditional access. Oh, I'm sorry, you're using conditional access for. I'm seeing if I can pull a link for adding apps. Let me see. I think Microsoft adds a option here. Let me see here. Yeah, here we go. So you'd asked Alan had asked, maybe we'd be able to manually configure the frequency of app discovery process on devices. I don't believe so. I think it just does a scan of that every time it checks in with Intune, which you can force a sync, but I don't think there's any setting within like each application to tell it how frequently it checks in with Intune. Seems the questions have slowed down. So once again, I just want to thank everyone for spending their morning with me, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.